The night after his father's funeral, Ethan Harper realized the house was no longer just quiet, was watching him. The air felt heavier, like it was holding its breath. Every sound carried too far, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of Tysates, the hallway clock, the wind brushing against the windows of the old New Hampshire home. At 32, Ethan had lived alone, traveled alone, and healed alone before. But this grief was different. This grief followed him room to room, reminding him that the one person who had always anchored him was gone. Daniel Harper had been more than a father. He had been steady, gentle, and present in ways Ethan only fully understood now that the presence was missing. Cancer had taken him quickly, leaving behind unfinished conversations and a house full of memories that refused to stay quiet. After the burial, friends went back to their lives. Condolences faded. Silence moved in, and Margaret remained. Margaret Harper, his stepmother, stood at the center of it all. She had married Daniel 6 years earlier, when Ethan was already grown. Their relationship had always been polite, distant, respectful. She was organized, thoughtful, and reserved. She didn't raise her voice or cry in public. She kept things running. Even now, she made coffee every morning at the same time, folded laundry with perfect corners, and spoke in calm, careful sentences. Ethan had never known what she felt beneath that calm. That first night, just before 9:30, she called his name. "Ethan," she said from the living room. He froze at the top of the stairs. Something in her tone made his chest tighten. It wasn't harsh or demanding. It was steady, certain. "It's time," she added. He didn't know what she meant, but he went anyway. The living room lights were dim. A single lamp cast long shadows across the walls. Margaret stood by the fireplace holding a small wooden box worn at the edges like it had been handled often. She set it on the coffee table between them. "Your father asked me to do this," she said, "every night, for 1 month." She opened the box. Inside were envelopes neatly stacked, each with a date written in Daniel's familiar handwriting. Ethan's breath caught. Seeing his father's writing felt like hearing his voice again. "He wrote these before he got sick enough to tell us," Margaret continued. "He wanted you to hear them out loud." Ethan shook his head slowly. "I don't think I can." Margaret met his eyes. I didn't think I could either." She slid the box toward him. One. His hands trembled as he lifted the first envelope. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than words. He sat on the couch, the same couch where his father used to fall asleep during baseball games, and opened it. The letter began simply. "Son," that single word broke something open in him. He read aloud, his voice low at first, then steadier as the sentences flowed. Daniel wrote about small things, about pride, about mistakes, about wishing he'd said "I love you" more often. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand, just honesty. By the time Ethan finished, his throat hurt. The silence afterward was unbearable. Margaret didn't speak. She just listened. When Ethan finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "Is that it?" he asked. "For tonight," she said. "Tomorrow we'd do it again." That night, Ethan barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard his father's voice echoing through the words. It felt like reopening a wound on purpose. It felt cruel. And yet, a strange part of him was relieved. The grief had direction now, a time, a place. The second night came faster than he expected. Again, Margaret called him at 9:30. Again, the box waited. Again, he read. Each letter dug deeper. His father spoke about Ethan's childhood, about moments Ethan had forgotten teaching him to ride a bike. Sitting outside his college dorm after Mauvin Day, pretending not to worry. The letters were gentle, but they carried weight. Ethan felt himself cracking open night after night. By the fourth night, he was dreading the clock. "Why are we doing this?" he finally asked, his voice sharp with exhaustion. "Why every night? Why like this?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment. A calm slipped. just enough to show something raw beneath it. Because stopping would be worse, she said quietly. Ethan didn't understand then. He only knew that reading the letters felt terrifying in a way he couldn't explain. Not because they were frightening, but because they were final. Each one was a reminder that his father was not coming back. As the days passed, something else began to change. Margaret stayed in the room longer after the readings. Sometimes she brought tea, sometimes she sat closer. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them shifted. It no longer felt empty. It felt shared. One night, Ethan arrived late. Work had run long, and he hoped selfishly that the ritual might be skipped. Margaret was waiting. "You promised," she said gently. "I know," he replied. This is hard." She nodded. "I know." That was the first time she had said it like that. Not as an observer, as someone inside the pain. Knight's letter was different. Daniel wrote about Margaret, about meeting her after years of loneliness, about finding comfort again when he thought that chapter of his life was closed. Ethan felt strange reading it aloud, like he was stepping into something private. When he finished, he couldn't look at her. "I didn't know," he said. Margaret folded her hands together. "He was afraid you'd think I replaced your mother." Ethan shook his head. "I never thought that." She smiled faintly. "He hoped you wouldn't." The air felt heavy with things unsaid. As the first week ended, Ethan realized something unsettling. The letters were no longer the scariest part of the nights. The scariest part was what happened after. The quiet conversation, the shared memories. The growing awareness that he and Margaret were leaning on each other in ways neither had planned. One evening, after a particularly emotional letter, Ethan stood abruptly. "I need air." Margaret followed him onto the porch. The cold night wrapped around them, sharp and clear. "He made me promise," she said suddenly, "that I wouldn't let you run from this." Ethan stared out at the dark yard. "Why?" "Because he knew you," she said. "You bury things. You move on too fast." He exhaled slowly. "And you?" She hesitated. "I disappear into routines." They stood there, two adults bound by the same loss, realizing how much they had avoided feeling before now. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, the word terrifying finally made sense. It wasn't the letters, it was the change. Grief was forcing them into honesty, into closeness, into something unfamiliar. By the end of the first part of the month, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Whatever his father had planned with those letters wasn't just about saying goodbye. It was about what came after. And that realization unsettled him more than any letter ever could. The last envelope felt heavier than all the others combined, as if it carried not just words but a final test. Ethan noticed it the moment he walked into the living room. The wooden box sat open on the table, only one envelope left inside. Margaret was already there, standing instead of sitting, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The clock read 9:29. Ethan's heart raced. He had known this night would come, but knowing didn't make it easier. For weeks, the letters had shaped his nights, given his grief a voice and a direction. Now that voice was about to go silent. "Once we open it," Ethan said quietly, "that's it." Margaret nodded. "I know." He picked up the envelope. His father's handwriting was slower on this one, the ink slightly uneven. Ethan could almost picture Daniel at the desk, pausing between sentences, choosing each word carefully. He sat down, took a breath, and opened it. The letter began without greeting. "If you're reading this, then you've made it through the hardest part?" Ethan's voice stayed steady, though his chest burned. Daniel wrote about nights spent awake, thinking about the people he would leave behind. He wrote about fear, about regret, and about hope. He said grief was not something to escape, but something to walk through slowly, with honesty. He spoke of Ethan's strength, of Margaret's quiet courage, and of how he trusted them to take care of each other, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. When Ethan reached the final line, he stopped. Don't be afraid of what grows from loss. Sometimes it's the truest thing we have. Silence followed. Not the sharp, empty silence from the early nights, but a soft one, a silence that felt complete. Margaret sat down slowly, as if the room itself might break if she moved too fast. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She looked at the empty box, then at Ethan. "It's over," she said. Ethan nodded, but the word felt wrong. Over meant finished. This didn't feel finished. It felt like standing at the edge of something, new without knowing where it led. That night, neither of them went to bed right away. They stayed in the living room, talking for the first time without a letter guiding the conversation. They spoke about Daniel, about the house, about small memories that surfaced when the pressure was gone. The fear that once lived in the ritual had shifted into something else in certainty. The next night at 9:30, the house stayed quiet. No letter, no box. Ethan found himself checking the clock anyway. Margaret noticed. "You don't have to come in here," she said gently. "No," he replied. "I just wanted to see if it felt different." It did. The absence of the ritual left a hollow space. For weeks, grief had structure. Now it was loose again, unpredictable. Days passed, then a week. Margaret began sorting through Daniel's study, packing books into boxes, deciding what to keep and what to give away. Ethan helped when he could, though some days he stayed late at work just to avoid the quiet house. One evening, Margaret handed him a folder. "These were in his desk," she said. "I think he wanted you to have them." Inside were old photos, letters, and one folded page written in Daniel's hand. Not dated, not sealed. Ethan read it alone later that night. It wasn't a letter. It was a reflection. Daniel wrote about second chances, about how life sometimes brought people together through unexpected paths. He wrote that love didn't always look the way it did the first time. Sometimes it grew from shared loss, shared patience, shared listening. Ethan folded the page carefully, his thoughts racing. He wasn't frightened, but he was unsettled. The closeness he and Margaret had developed felt real, but also fragile. He didn't want to misread it. He didn't want to hurt her, or himself. The next few weeks tested that balance. Margaret laughed more. Ethan noticed it first at dinner, then during small moments around the house. The laughter didn't erase. Grief it lived beside it. They took walks together, sometimes talking, sometimes not. The connection between them was quiet but steady. One night, during a storm, the power went out. They sat in the living room with candles, shadows dancing on the walls. "This used to scare me," Margaret admitted. "The dark." Ethan smiled faintly. "It still does. A little." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "You're different," she said. "Stronger, but softer too." "So are you," he replied. The words lingered. Ethan began to understand what his father meant. The terrifying thing had never been the letters themselves. It was what they opened. They forced honesty. They stripped away distance. They left two grieving adults facing each other without walls. Still neither crossed any line. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Changed one quiet Sunday morning. Margaret was packing the last box from the study when she stopped suddenly, holding Daniel's old sweater. She pressed it to her chest, her shoulders shaking. It was the first time Ethan had seen her truly break. He didn't hesitate, crossed the room and stood beside her. "I miss him," she whispered. "I know," Ethan said. She leaned against him, not clinging, not desperate, just tired. Ethan wrapped his arm around her, steady and gentle. It felt natural. It felt safe. That moment, Ethan realized something important. Connection didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly after pain had cleared the space. Weeks later, Margaret decided to sell the house. The choice was hard, but right. The house had served its purpose. It had held grief, memory, and healing. Now it was time to move. Forward. On the last night before the sale, Ethan stood in the empty living room. The box was gone. The letters were gone. But the echoes remained. Margaret joined him. "I'm moving closer to my sister," she said. "In Vermont." Ethan nodded. "That's good." There was a pause. A long one. "You don't have to disappear from my life," she added carefully. "I want to," he replied. They shared a small, understanding smile. As Ethan drove away the next morning, he felt something he hadn't expected: peace. Not happiness in the traditional sense, but acceptance. His father was gone. The letters were finished. But the love Daniel left behind had not vanished. It had transformed. Months later, Ethan visited Margaret in Vermont. They walked by the lake, talked about ordinary things, and remembered Daniel without pain. Their bond was still gentle, still respectful, but stronger now, built on truth, not fear. Ethan finally understood. The terrifying thing his stepmother had asked him to do every night wasn't about reliving loss. It was about learning how to live after it. And that lesson, once learned, never truly ended.